July 16th, Toyo Business Edition will have its 15A1 release. And in that release, we're introducing a pretty cool little feature called Advanced Candidate Workflow. Advanced Candidate Workflow will allow you to do a lot of kind of interesting things. I'm going to show you one or two of them in this video just so you can get ready for this feature. The first notion is that you could potentially track a candidate differently depending on how they're added to the system. So if they apply through the careers website like this candidate has, they could potentially just go through the normal process like you have today. But if I take this candidate and assign them to a different rec, currently it's going ahead and putting in the rec specific status, which has ID equals 2, which for you might be submitted to rec, for me it's new. But there's nothing really that differentiates that candidate as being passively added to that requisition. When I look at a list of candidates, it's just a list of candidates and the status is new, just like potentially some other candidates. So I'm going to remove this candidate and then I'm going to show you how I might change things up a little bit to make tracking that candidate that I've added to the requisition a little bit easier. So the first thing I'm going to do in Customize Recruit, I'm going to go into the candidate workflow and I'm going to create a main status. So candidate main status, and I'm going to call it passive. I'm using all caps here because I want to easily be able to differentiate my main status versus my rec specific status. Now I'm going back to Customize and now I'm going to make a rec specific status that is the same. I'm going to edit any workflow, click on add status, call it passive, this time lowercase just as a visual indicator. And when I add somebody as passive, I want to set their main status. If by any strange method I move them into a passive state, which I normally wouldn't do, I'm going to update their main status to passive. But I'm going to protect pretty much everything else. Okay, great. So now I've got a rec specific status called passive. I'm halfway done. I'm going to go into administration and into my status mappings, and you'll see that there's a couple of new things here. One of them is the initial candidate status defaults. What this is doing is it's saying when a candidate's added to the system through some method, what status should it go into? So what I'm saying is, I'll say when I add someone to rec, I want them to be in passive. In fact, I'm going to say if I add them to a rec through any method where they haven't applied, if they apply through the careers website, they're coming in as new, might be submitted to rec for you. But if I add them any other way, I want them to be in as passive. And guess what? If I add the candidate to their first requisition, I also want them to be put in as passive. Okay, so only when it's to their first requisition. So the things aren't moving midstream. And if I add them into the system with no rec associated, well, by golly, I want those to all be passive too. So what happens that's different? Let's go back and look at our candidate. Now, when I say to my candidate, I would like to associate them with this requisition, it comes in as passive. Now, along the way, we've also introduced a new field called starting status so that I can always tell how did that candidate get into the system. So if I wanted to even be more granular, I could. Let's say that I have a rec-specific candidate workflow status that is imported, and maybe that's for when I import from some CSV file. And we'll add them as passive. We'll protect pretty much everything else. It's really sort of irrelevant because it's going to be set as the new candidate is added anyway. And now if I wanted, I could go to my status mappings and to my initial candidate status, and I could set my imported to import. Now when I look at a candidate, I know exactly how they came into the system. So you should be able to see your passive against active candidates. I'm now going to speak about how I would invite a passive candidate to apply for a job, also a part of this feature set that we've added. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my rec-specific candidate workflow, and if I'm going to invite a candidate for a job, I probably need there to be some way that they can tell me that they're not interested for that job. And for interested, I will set them back to available unless they're in an active state. Okay, so what this is saying is when they identify to me that they're not interested, it'll set them as available for other requisitions. However, if they are in process because they're in one of these statuses, probably not that one, we will not make any changes to their main status. Okay, great. So now I have a not interested status, and I am going to now go into my status mappings, and we have this new not interested mapping, and I'm going to say, hey, when somebody says that they're not interested, set them as not interested, put them back as available, and choose the requisition reason for rejection as the candidate expressed that they're not interested. I've probably added that already. Okay, great. Now, in my workflow, let's say that a candidate has been added passively, because you've seen I have this new passive status. Now I'm going to set the order for this and move passive up to the top, because it's pretty much the same as new. Okay, so I've got a passive status, but I don't have any next steps. I probably want some next steps. And I want to assign the next step of inviting them to apply for a specific requisition, and I might also put that I've rejected them if I look again and decide that they're not the right candidate. Now, as soon as I added invite, it's asking for some other information. So it's saying, what is the invitation email? We've seeded one that is called invitation to apply, so I'm going to choose that one. And then I can choose the application form that I want the candidate to be invited to. Now, this candidate has never applied for this job before, so I'm going to choose the application that's assigned to the requisition. They'll get invited to participate with the same application form that everybody else would. And after the candidate is been sent the invitation, I have the ability to set a specific status so I can see what's going on. Now, I forgot to do that, so let's just save that invite action on my passive, and let's create a new status which we'll call invited. So the candidate's invited to apply. Now when they're invited to apply, you know what, actually I'll just leave it in passive and I will protect everything. Okay, so now I have invited. Let me set the order here again. Move that up below passive. And put new afterwards. Okay, so now the candidate's added to the system. I invite them. They're still passive. And when I invite them, potentially they're going to get an email, and from that email they're either going to say that they're not interested, which would automatically set them to not interested because we've mapped that, or they will apply for the job. Now, how would we get them once they're invited into new? Kind of the last step. I'm going to go into the application form, and I'm going to say on my application form, when anybody completes this application form, set them to new. So the candidate is invited, presented with this application form. We now have this new resulting status, and when the candidate fills out that application form, they're set to new. Okay, great. So let's go back to Joe Candidate. I added Joe Candidate to this system. Joe Candidate's never applied for it, is in passive status. I just click on invite. Oh, it's not posted to a careers website. Well, there you go. Little safety check there, which is great. Let's just post this job. And let's go back to Joe Applicant. And here we see that we have the ability to invite or reject. I can click on invite. It shows me the invitation that's going to go out, and away I go. Now when Joe Applicant gets that invitation, there'll be options on it. They'll be able to click through and be able to apply for the job, or click through and identify that they're not interested. Now we have the ability to track that a candidate has been added passively, and we also have the ability to invite them to apply and be able to manage where they appear in the workflow as they take any of those steps. So there's a little sneak peek. I hope everything is very useful for you. And after July 16th, we'll be able to see this in action and modify our workflows to update these new features. Thanks for watching.